Hazardous materials, commonly referred to as hazmat, are substances or materials that the DOT has determined are capable of posing an unreasonable risk to health, safety, and property when transported in commerce. Examples of some common hazmat you may encounter include gasoline, oxygen, propane, and fireworks. As a hazmat employee, you are likely aware of the HMR, which are a set of rules established by PHMSA to ensure hazmat is packaged and handled safely during transport. The requirements of the HMR also help communicate to motor carriers, hazmat employees, and emergency responders the potential hazards of any material being shipped. The HMR requires every hazmat employee be trained and tested before they perform any task subject to the regulations. However, an employee may perform hazmat job functions before completing training if they are under the direct supervision of a trained hazmat employee and their training will be completed within 90 days. All hazmat employees must be trained in the areas of general awareness, function-specific, safety, and security awareness training. First, your general awareness training will help you get familiar with the HMR and its requirements, and will enable you to recognize and properly identify hazardous materials. Your function-specific training addresses the HMR requirements that apply to the specific job or function that you perform. Safety training covers hazmat emergency response information requirements, how to protect yourself from hazards associated with exposure to hazardous materials, as well as how to avoid accidents. And your security awareness training will introduce security risks associated with the hazmat transportation process and ways to enhance security. It'll also include how to recognize and respond to a possible security threat. This video helps you meet the general awareness training requirement. It was designed to familiarize you with the HMR to help you work safely around hazmat. We'll introduce you to a number of general hazmat topics and call out areas where you'll need additional or function-specific training as it relates to the job you do. We've already talked about each required training component, and soon you'll be able to determine if a material is hazardous, as well as recognize the hazard classes and divisions used to identify it. You'll learn what makes a material a hazardous substance, hazardous waste, marine pollutant, or elevated temperature material. And finally, you'll be able to indicate to others the importance of the hazmat table and use it to communicate a material's hazards through shipping papers, markings, labels, and placards. The first step in shipping a material is determining what it is and if it is subject to the HMR. In other words, is it a hazardous material? For you to determine whether a material is hazardous, you must know the hazards of the material as well as the different hazard classifications and divisions in the HMR. You must know the criteria for hazardous substances, hazardous wastes, marine pollutants, elevated temperature materials, and limited quantities or other regulated materials. I know that's a lot to remember, but no worries. We'll go through each of these steps in more detail right now. You'll begin by determining if the material is explosive, flammable, combustible, poisonous, radioactive, or corrosive. For some materials, this is easy, since the material and its hazards may be well known. For example, gasoline is a common flammable liquid. For other materials, the hazard may not be known, or there may be some question as to what the hazard is. These materials need to be tested to determine their hazards. This is often true for new products, mixtures, and solutions. There are 9 hazard classes used to assign the category of a hazard to a material. A material may meet the defining criteria for more than one hazard class, but is assigned to only one. Some hazard classes are subdivided further into divisions. In addition to the hazard classes and divisions, a material may also be regulated because it is a hazardous substance, hazardous waste, marine pollutant, or an elevated temperature material. A hazardous substance is listed in Appendix A to 49 CFR 172.101 and is in a quantity in one package that meets or exceeds the reportable quantity, or RQ. Hazardous substances include asbestos, PCBs, and lead. A hazardous waste is a material subject to the hazardous waste manifest requirements of the Environmental Protection Agency as specified in 40 CFR 262. Common hazardous waste you might run into include solvents and pesticides. A marine pollutant is listed in Appendix B to 49 CFR 172.101 and is packaged in a concentration which equals or exceeds 10% for marine pollutants and 1% for severe marine pollutants. Marine pollutants are always regulated by vessel, but are only regulated by air, rail, or highway when in bulk packagings like a cargo tank. Aldrin, DDT, and turpentine are all common examples of marine pollutants. An elevated temperature material is a material in a bulk package that is in a liquid phase at a temperature at or above 212 degrees Fahrenheit, in a liquid phase with a flash point at or above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that is intentionally heated above its flash point, or in a solid phase at room temperature at or above 464 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt and molten sulfur are both examples of possible elevated temperature materials. Often thought of as a separate classification, limited quantity, or ORMD, is a hazardous material in classes 2 to 9 that meets specific exception requirements in the regulations. These materials present a limited hazard during transportation due to their form, quantity, and packaging. Common examples include bleach, small arms ammunition, cosmetics, and drain cleaners. Because of their limited hazard, they are often not subject to many of the regulations. Once you've determined the material you are shipping is in fact a hazardous material, you must reference the hazmat table to select a description or proper shipping name that best describes it. The hazmat table is important because it provides a majority of the information you need to properly prepare and transport a hazardous material. Rows in the hazmat table are an alphabetical listing of thousands of shipping names and descriptions, which can be used to describe a hazardous material. The columns, there are 10, are labeled by category, such as identification number, packing group, and label codes. These columns provide important information for preparing and shipping the material. The HMR requires each shipper to properly classify a material and to communicate the material's hazards through the use of basic descriptions on shipping papers, markings and labels on packages, and placards and markings on transport vehicles. Shipping papers, which can be a shipping order, bill of lading, or a manifest, play a very important role in the hazmat transportation process. If an accident or incident occurs, shipping papers provide emergency responders with much of the information they need to quickly and appropriately respond. When an incident occurs, time is critical. That is why shipping papers must be filled out correctly and with accurate information about the materials being transported. Let's take a brief look at a typical shipping paper. If both hazardous and non-hazardous materials are entered on the same document, anyone reading it must be able to clearly distinguish between the two. This can be accomplished by entering the hazardous materials first, identifying the hazardous materials with an X or RQ in the HM column, or entering the hazardous materials in a contrasting color. Hazmat entries may be highlighted, but only on shipping paper copies and not on the original shipping paper. In order to properly describe each hazardous material being transported, the hazmat table needs to be referenced. Let's walk through how this is done together. First, the number and type of packages are entered here. Then, the hazmat table is referenced to fill in the identification number, followed by the hazmat's proper shipping name. Next, the hazard class or division is written down. Any subsidiary hazard class or division number should be entered inside parentheses. If a packing group is listed, it would be entered here. Finally, the total quantity of hazmat is entered. Shipping papers are required for each and every hazmat shipment across all modes of transportation, unless not required by the HMR, such as limited quantities and ORMDs. These exceptions are very common, and employees need to be aware of them. In most cases, the person offering the hazmat for transport must prepare the shipping papers, but it's important you know what a properly filled out shipping paper looks like. While the hazmat regulations do not specify the exact kind of form to use for shipping papers, the regulations are specific about what information needs to be provided. Most hazmat shipments must have emergency response information either on or with the shipping papers. The emergency response information can be provided by a safety data sheet, an emergency response guidebook, or another form that provides all the required information. Markings provide valuable information about the hazardous material that is inside a packaging, freight container, rail car, or transport vehicle. They are often used with labels and placards to help communicate information about the hazmat. Labels and placards communicate the hazard class or division, while markings often provide additional, more specific information about the hazmat, such as this marking, which indicates the ID number and proper shipping name next to a label. In many situations, markings are used when labels and placards are not required. Markings must be durable, in English, and printed on or affixed to the surface of a package, label, tag, or sign. They must be displayed on a background of sharply contrasting color, not concealed or hidden by other labels or attachments, and positioned away from other markings or advertising to avoid confusion. Most labels are 4-inch by 4-inch diamonds designed to communicate an immediate warning of a material's hazards. The colors and symbols on labels provide instant identification of the hazard or division of the material inside a packaging during the transportation process. Labeling requirements are targeted almost exclusively at smaller packagings, with a few exceptions. The HMR has specific requirements for design, placement, use, prohibitions, and exceptions for labels. Labels must be durable, weather-resistant, and able to withstand a 30-day exposure to transport conditions without deterioration or substantial color change. Labels can be used to communicate two types of hazards. A primary hazard label indicates a hazmat's most hazardous property. A subsidiary hazard label indicates a secondary, less hazardous property. When primary and subsidiary hazard labels are both required, they must be displayed within 6 inches of each other. It is a shipper's responsibility to label packagings. However, the carrier must make sure the package labeling is consistent with the hazmat shipping description before accepting and transporting it. Placards look very similar to labels, but are much larger in size, 10 inches by 10 inches. Most bulk packagings, freight containers, unit load devices, transport vehicles, and rail cars containing hazmat must be placarded on each side and each end. Placards communicate the hazards associated with the material and provide emergency responders with important information if a hazmat incident occurs. And when a placard also displays an identification number marking, the two together tell emergency responders exactly what hazard and hazardous materials they are dealing with. The 3 indicates the material is a Class 3 flammable, and the 2333 indicates the material is allyl acetate. In most situations, the person who offers hazmat for transport is responsible for providing the carrier with the required placards and markings. No motor carrier may transport a hazmat until the required placards and markings are in place. This general awareness video was just the start of your hazmat training. Now that you are familiar with the HMR and are able to recognize and properly identify hazardous materials, it's time to determine where your training goes from here. I don't have to tell you, hazardous materials are dangerous. No matter what your job or function is in the transportation of hazmat, remember your training and perform your tasks right every time. The health and safety of others depends on it.